Welcome to Double Double 2 Stories by Elia Chish. Today, stories and about a secret 3 a.m. meeting and decided D-Day. Now let me hand it over to my assistant Bob.
My name is Bob. I'm Ilya's assistant, and tonight I'm going to tell you about a decision that changed the course of human history. This is the story of a secret meeting that almost nobody knew about for 20 years after it happened. A meeting at 3 o'clock in the morning between two men who held the fate of the world in their hands. This is about the night Dwight Eisenhower and Winston Churchill met alone in darkness while rain pounded against the windows and made the choice that would either save civilization or doom it to years more of Nazi tyranny. June 5th, 1944, 3 o'clock in the morning. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Southwick House, Portsmouth, England. The rain is relentless, driven by winds that shake the windows. Inside a small office, two men sit across from each other. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, leader of Great Britain. No aides present, no secretaries taking notes, no officers standing by. Just these two men, the weight of the world on their shoulders, and a decision that must be made in the next few hours. In approximately 6 hours, Eisenhower must give a final order that will commit 156,000 soldiers, 5,000 ships, and 11,000 aircraft to the largest military invasion in human history, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. D-Day, Operation Overlord, the second front that Stalin has been demanding for years. The operation that will either liberate Europe or end in catastrophic failure that could prolong the war for years. But there is a problem. The weather is a nightmare. The seas are violent. The winds are too strong. The clouds are too thick. Every practical military consideration says that launching this invasion tomorrow is madness. The troops will drown before they reach the beaches. The paratroopers will be scattered across France. The bombers will not be able to see their targets. It will be a massacre. But delaying the invasion might be even worse, because 156,000 men already know the details of the plan. Every day of delay is another day that secret could leak to the Germans. And if the Germans know where and when the Allies are coming, D-Day will not be a battle. It will be a slaughter. This is why Eisenhower and Churchill are meeting in secret at 3 in the morning, because some decisions are too terrible to be made by committee. Some choices are too heavy to be shared with subordinates. Some moments in history come down to two human beings sitting in a room, trying to decide if they should risk everything on a gamble that might save the world or might destroy it. To understand how these two men ended up in this impossible position, we need to go back 48 hours to June 3, 1944, when the first weather report started coming in and everyone realized that the plan they had spent 2 years building was about to collide with forces beyond human control. Operation Overlord was the most complex military operation ever conceived. The planning had begun in 1942, immediately after America entered the war. British and American staffs had worked together for 2 years, coordinating every detail. The operation required assembling the largest invasion fleet in history, 5,000 ships of every type, battleships to bombard the coast, destroyers to protect the transports, landing craft to carry the troops to the beaches, supply ships to sustain the army once it landed. This fleet had to be gathered from ports all across southern England, coordinated down to the minute, and sent across the English Channel simultaneously. The air component was equally massive, 11,000 aircraft, bombers to strike German defenses before the invasion, fighters to protect the bombers and the ships, transports to drop paratroopers behind enemy lines, gliders to land troops in key positions. All of this had to happen in darkness, in coordination with the naval landings at dawn. And then there were the troops themselves, 156,000 men in the first wave, American, British, Canadian, infantry to storm the beaches, paratroopers to secure the flanks, engineers to clear obstacles, medics to treat the wounded. All of them trained for months, briefed on their specific objectives, loaded onto ships and aircraft, waiting for the order to go. The entire operation depended on secrecy. The Germans knew an invasion was coming. They had been preparing defenses along the entire coast of France for years. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been put in charge of coastal defenses and had worked frantically to turn the beaches into killing zones. Millions of mines planted, beach obstacles designed to rip apart landing craft, artillery positioned to cover every approach, machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire. The Atlantic Wall was not impenetrable, but attacking it would require overwhelming force applied at exactly the right place and time. The Allies had spent months conducting an elaborate deception campaign to convince the Germans that the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. They created fake armies. They fed false information through double agents. They conducted diversionary operations. The deception was working. German intelligence believed the main invasion would hit Calais, but this advantage would evaporate if the invasion was delayed too long. If troops sat on ships for days, word would leak. If the schedule changed repeatedly, the Germans would realize something was wrong. Secrecy had a time limit, and that limit was measured in days, not weeks. The invasion also required very specific conditions. It needed to happen at low tide so engineers could clear beach obstacles before the main landings. It needed to happen shortly after dawn, so the naval bombardment would have enough light to be accurate. It needed a full moon the night before so paratroopers could see the land. These conditions only occurred a few days each month. In June 1944, the window was June 5th, 6th, or 7th. After that, the tides and moon would not align again until early July. Eisenhower had chosen June 5th as D-Day. Everything was set. The troops were loaded onto ships by June 3rd. The fleet began moving toward assembly points. The paratroopers were preparing to board aircraft. The bombers were being armed and fueled. The countdown had begun, and then the meteorologists delivered their forecast, and everything fell apart. June 3rd, morning. The weather briefing at Southwick House. Group Captain James Stagg, chief meteorologist for SHAEF, stood before Eisenhower and his senior commanders. The news was bad. A major storm system was moving across the Atlantic toward the English Channel. It would arrive on June 5th, bringing high winds, heavy clouds, and rough seas. Conditions would be completely unsuitable for the invasion. Eisenhower listened to the report in silence. Around him sat the senior Allied commanders. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding all ground forces for the invasion, Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commanding the naval forces, Air Chief Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, commanding the air forces, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army. Each of them understood what this meant. The invasion could not proceed in these conditions. The ships carrying the troops were already at sea, moving toward France. Eisenhower made the first painful decision. Delay D-Day by 24 hours. Postpone from June 5th to June 6th. Order the fleet to turn around and return to port. Tell 156,000 men, packed onto ships and ready to go, that they had to wait another day. The psychological impact would be severe. The operational complications would be immense. But there was no choice. The order went out. The fleet turned back. The troops, who had been psychologically prepared to land in France within hours, had to stand down. Some of them had already been at sea for days, living in the cramped, miserable conditions of troop transports. Now they had to go back, wait, and prepare to do it all over again. The risk of someone talking, of information leaking, increased with every hour of delay. But postponing one day did not solve the fundamental problem. It just delayed the decision. On the evening of June 4th, Eisenhower convened another weather conference. Group Captain Stagg delivered his updated forecast. The storm would indeed hit on June 5th, as predicted. But there was a possibility, not a certainty, just a possibility, of a brief break in the weather on the morning of June 6th. The winds might drop slightly. The clouds might lift enough for air operations. The seas might calm just enough for the landing craft to reach the beaches. But it was a narrow window, 36 hours at most. After that, another storm system would move in and conditions would deteriorate again. Stagg could not give a confident prediction. Weather forecasting in 1944 was not an exact science. There were no satellites, no computer models, no radar coverage of the Atlantic. Forecasts were based on reports from weather stations, ships at sea, and aircraft reconnaissance, combined with the experience and judgment of the meteorologists. Stagg believed there would be a break in the weather on June 6th, but he could not guarantee it. He was asking Eisenhower to bet the entire invasion and the lives of 156,000 men on a weather forecast that might be wrong. The commanders discussed options. Montgomery was in favor of going ahead. He believed the troops were ready, the plan was sound, and delay was more dangerous than bad weather. Admiral Ramsey was deeply concerned about the naval conditions. Rough seas would make it almost impossible for the landing craft to reach the beaches in good order. Many craft would swamp. Troops would be seasick and exhausted before they even reached France. Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory was worried about the air operations. If the clouds did not lift, the bombers would not be able to support the landings, and the paratroopers would be dropped blind. Eisenhower listened to all of them. Then he made a provisional decision. The invasion would go ahead on the morning of June 6th, based on the hope that Stagg's forecast was correct and there would be a break in the weather. But it was not a final decision. He would convene one more conference early on the morning of June 5th, get the latest weather update, and make the final call then. If conditions looked impossible, he could still postpone again. But another postponement would mean waiting 2 weeks for the next favorable tide and moon conditions. 2 weeks of 156,000 men sitting on ships or in camps, knowing the invasion plan, vulnerable to German intelligence. 2 weeks of strain on the alliance, with Stalin demanding action and American public opinion growing impatient. 2 weeks for the Germans to potentially discover the deception and move forces to Normandy. The meeting ended. The commanders dispersed to their headquarters to wait. Eisenhower returned to his quarters, but did not sleep. He paced. He smoked. He stared at the maps. The weight of command had never been heavier. If he went ahead and the weather was too bad, thousands of men would die in the water before they ever reached the enemy. The invasion could fail catastrophically. The Allies might not get another chance for years. Germany might develop new weapons. The Soviet Union might make a separate peace. The entire course of the war could turn on this decision. But if he delayed again, the operational security of the entire invasion was at risk. The troops were already strained. The logistics were becoming unmanageable. The political pressure was intense, and the window of opportunity was closing. Eisenhower had commanded armies in North Africa and Italy. He had made difficult decisions before, but nothing compared to this. He was not just deciding the fate of 156,000 soldiers. He was deciding the fate of Europe, the fate of millions of people living under Nazi occupation, the fate of the entire Allied war effort. And he had to make this decision based on incomplete information, conflicting advice, and a weather forecast that might or might not be accurate. Sometime after midnight on June 5th, Eisenhower made a phone call. He contacted Winston Churchill and requested a private meeting. Immediately. No aides, no staff, just the two of them. Churchill agreed without hesitation. He understood that Eisenhower was facing the loneliest moment of command, and that sometimes a leader needs another leader to talk to. Not subordinates or advisors, but someone who understands the terrible weight of making decisions that will kill people, no matter what choice is made. At 3 o'clock in the morning on June 5th, 1944. Winston Churchill arrived at Southwick House. He and Eisenhower went into a small office and closed the door. What was said in that room was not recorded. No stenographer took notes. No aides were present to write memoirs. The only accounts we have come from brief mentions in Churchill's later writings and from Eisenhower's own sparse comments years after the war. But we know the substance of what they discussed because we know what decision was made and we know the character of both men. Eisenhower laid out the situation completely. He explained the weather forecast, the narrow window on June 6th, the risk of going ahead, the risk of delay, the impossible choice between two bad options. Churchill listened without interrupting. The Prime Minister had been making life and death decisions for 5 years of war. He had ordered British troops into battles that he knew would be costly. He had made strategic choices that sacrificed some objectives to achieve others. He had authorized bombing campaigns that killed civilians. He carried his own terrible burden of command. He understood what Eisenhower was facing. When Eisenhower finished, Churchill spoke. He did not try to make the decision for Eisenhower. He understood that this was the Supreme Commander's responsibility alone. But he offered something more valuable than advice. He offered perspective and support. Churchill reminded Eisenhower that great commanders throughout history had faced moments where they had to risk everything on uncertain information. He reminded him that no amount of planning can eliminate uncertainty, that war always involves risk, and that the leader's job is not to achieve certainty, but to make the best decision possible with imperfect information. Churchill also made clear that whatever Eisenhower decided, Britain would support him completely. If the invasion succeeded, the credit would be shared. If it failed, Churchill would not blame Eisenhower or distance himself politically. They would stand together. This was not just political calculation. This was Churchill understanding that Eisenhower needed to know he was not alone, that the burden of this decision did not rest solely on American shoulders, that the alliance was real and would hold regardless of the outcome. They discussed the cost of delay. Churchill understood the political dimension better than anyone. Stalin was demanding a second front. The Soviet Union had been carrying the burden of fighting Germany for 3 years. Soviet casualties numbered in the millions. Stalin's patience was not infinite. If the Western Allies delayed D-Day again, especially for weather, Stalin might question their commitment. He might begin to wonder if Britain and America intended to let the Soviets bleed while they waited for perfect conditions. The alliance with the Soviet Union was already strained by disagreements over post-war Europe. Further delay could damage that alliance irreparably. They discussed the troops. 156,000 men were waiting for the order. They had been trained. They had been briefed. They had been loaded onto ships. Many of them had been at sea for days already. They were as ready as they would ever be. But readiness has a peak, and that peak does not last forever. Delay saps morale. It creates doubt. Soldiers who have psyched themselves up to face death in battle cannot maintain that psychological edge indefinitely. Postponement after postponement would erode their will. Better to go now while they were still sharp than to wait and watch that edge dull. They discussed the weather itself. The forecast was uncertain, but it was not hopeless. Group Captain Stagg believed there would be a break. The winds would drop from 25 miles per hour to 15. The clouds would lift from complete overcast to broken cover. The seas would calm from 6-foot waves to 3 or 4 feet. None of these conditions were ideal, but all of them were survivable. The Navy could operate in 4-foot seas. The Air Force could bomb through broken clouds. The troops could land in moderate surf. It would be hard, but it could be done. And there was another factor that Churchill pointed out. The Germans would not expect an invasion in bad weather. Rommel himself had gone back to Germany for his wife's birthday because he believed the weather was too poor for the Allies to attack. German units were not on full alert. Their coastal defenses were manned, but not at maximum readiness. If Eisenhower went ahead despite the weather, the Allies might achieve even greater surprise than they had planned. The Germans might be caught completely unprepared, thinking that no sane commander would launch an invasion in these conditions. The conversation lasted perhaps an hour. When it ended, Eisenhower had made his decision. He would go ahead. He would order the invasion to proceed on the morning of June 6th. He would trust the meteorologist's forecast. He would accept the risk. He would bet everything on this narrow window of opportunity. It was not a decision made with confidence or certainty. It was a decision made with clear-eyed understanding of the terrible possibilities. But it was the decision that Eisenhower believed gave the Allies the best chance of success. Churchill left the way he had come, quietly, in darkness. Very few people even knew he had been there. The meeting remained secret for more than 20 years. Eisenhower returned to his desk and wrote something that he showed to no one at the time. He drafted a press release to be issued in case the invasion failed. The text was simple and devastating. Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. Eisenhower dated this message July 5th, a mistake that reveals how exhausted and stressed he was. He wrote it as June 5th, but his mind was already looking ahead to the consequences of failure. He folded the paper and put it in his wallet. It was his way of taking responsibility in advance. If this decision led to disaster, he would not blame the weather or the intelligence or his subordinates. He would accept the blame himself. That is what command means. At 4:15 in the morning on June 5th, 1944, Eisenhower convened the final weather conference. Group Captain Stagg gave his latest forecast. The break in the weather was still predicted for the morning of June 6th. Conditions would be marginal but workable. Eisenhower polled his commanders. Montgomery said go. Ramsey said the Navy could manage. Lee Mallory was still worried, but accepted the decision. Eisenhower looked at each of them, then said the words that committed 156,000 men to battle. Okay, we'll go. 3 words. The most important 3 words spoken in 1944. Perhaps the most important 3 words of the entire 20th century. With those words, the largest military operation in history was set in motion. Within hours, the ships began moving out of port again. The paratroopers began boarding the aircraft. The bombers were armed and sent to their targets. The countdown to D-Day had resumed, and this time it would not stop. June 6th, 1944. Dawn. The American, British, and Canadian troops hit the beaches of Normandy. The weather was exactly as forecasted. Not good, but workable. The winds had dropped to 15 miles per hour. The clouds had lifted enough for the bombers to see some of their targets. The seas were rough, 4 to 5 feet, enough to make many of the troops miserably seasick, enough to swamp some of the landing craft, but not enough to stop the invasion. The Germans were caught by surprise. Rommel was still in Germany. Other senior commanders were away from their posts or slow to react. The coastal defenses fought hard, but they were not reinforced quickly enough. By the end of the day, the Allies had established a foothold on French soil. It was costly. Thousands of men died on the beaches or in the air. Omaha Beach in particular was a near disaster, with American troops pinned down under withering fire, but the invasion succeeded. The second front was opened. The liberation of Europe had begun. Group Captain Stagg's forecast had been accurate. The break in the weather came exactly as predicted. 36 hours of marginally acceptable conditions. Then, just as Stagg had warned, the weather deteriorated again. Another storm rolled in on June 7th and 8th. If Eisenhower had delayed the invasion one more time, waiting for better weather, he would have run into that second storm. The invasion might not have been possible again until late June or early July. The operational security would have been compromised. The Germans might have discovered the deception. The entire outcome of the war might have been different. Eisenhower never spoke publicly about the meeting with Churchill at 3 in the morning. Churchill mentioned it only briefly in his memoirs, without going into detail. The full story did not emerge until historians began piecing it together decades later from scattered references and private papers. Even then, the exact words spoken in that room remain unknown. But the meeting mattered. It mattered because Eisenhower was carrying a burden that no human being should have to carry alone, and Churchill understood that sometimes the most important thing a leader can do is simply be present with another leader who is facing an impossible choice. The decision to go ahead with D-Day on June 6th was Eisenhower's decision. He made it. He accepted responsibility for it. But he made it after talking with the one other person in the Allied command structure who truly understood the weight of such decisions. Churchill did not make the decision for him. Churchill did not even advise him what to decide. Churchill simply reminded him that he was not alone, that the alliance was real, and that whatever happened, they would face it together. There is a tendency, when we look back at history, to see the decisions that worked out as inevitable, as obvious, as the only rational choice. D-Day succeeded. Therefore, Eisenhower's decision to go ahead must have been clearly correct. But that is not how it felt on June 5, 1944. On that day, in that moment, the decision was agonizing. The weather was terrible. The forecast was uncertain. The risks were enormous. Eisenhower could easily have chosen to delay again. Many commanders would have. The consequences of failure were so catastrophic that caution would have been understandable, even rational. But Eisenhower chose to go ahead, to trust the forecast, to accept the risk, and that decision changed the world. The note that Eisenhower wrote, accepting blame in advance if the invasion failed, was found in his wallet weeks later. He never had to release it. The invasion succeeded. But the fact that he wrote it tells us something profound about leadership. Real leadership is not about taking credit when things go right. Real leadership is about accepting responsibility when things go wrong. Eisenhower understood that if D-Day failed, the blame would fall on him regardless of the weather, regardless of the intelligence, regardless of what his subordinates did or did not do. So he accepted that responsibility in advance. He wrote the words that would end his career and probably his place in history. And then he made the decision anyway. Winston Churchill's role in that decision was quieter, but no less important. He did not command the invasion. He did not override Eisenhower's authority. He did not try to share the glory or deflect the potential blame. He simply showed up at 3 in the morning when Eisenhower needed someone to talk to. He listened, he offered perspective, he promised support. And then he left, allowing Eisenhower to make the decision that only Eisenhower could make. That is leadership too, knowing when to step forward and when to step back, knowing when to advise and when to simply be present, knowing that sometimes the most important thing you can do is help another person carry a burden that cannot be shared but also cannot be borne entirely alone. The success of D-Day did not guarantee victory in World War II. There were still 11 months of hard fighting ahead. The Battle of the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine, the final defeat of Germany. Tens of thousands more would die before the war ended. But D-Day made victory possible. It opened the second front that Stalin had been demanding. It brought the full weight of American and British military power to bear on Nazi Germany. It began the liberation of Western Europe. And it happened because 2 men sat in a room at 3 in the morning and decided that despite all the risks, Despite all the uncertainty, despite all the terrible possibilities, the time to act was now. If you found this story compelling, I encourage you to subscribe to WW2 Stories by Ilya Cheese. Leave a comment and let us know what you think. Do you believe Eisenhower made the right decision? What would you have done in his position? And where are you watching from? We love hearing from viewers around the world. The story of that secret meeting reminds us that history is not made by abstract forces or inevitable trends. History is made by human beings making decisions under impossible pressure with incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. Eisenhower and Churchill were not superhuman. They did not have perfect knowledge. They could not see the future. They were two men trying to do their best in circumstances that offered no good options, only less bad ones. They chose to act rather than wait. They chose to trust their judgment rather than demand perfect certainty. They chose to risk failure rather than guarantee paralysis. And because of those choices, made in darkness while rain pounded against the windows, the world changed. Europe was liberated. Nazi tyranny was defeated. And the course of human history turned toward freedom rather than darkness. That is what leadership means. Not having all the answers, not being certain of success, but making the decision anyway, accepting the responsibility, and trusting that courage and commitment can overcome uncertainty and risk. On June 5th, 1944, at 3 o'clock in the morning, two men demonstrated that kind of leadership. And the world has never been the same.